Even though we've seen the Straw Hat crew sail over and even under the Red Line, we still have a lot of unanswered questions about the mountain that the Celestial Dragons call home. Like, why was it called God's Land even long before Merijois was up there? It seems those gods that Whitebeard talked about were the Lunarians, and they've almost been wiped out completely, and the government is still hunting them down to this very day. So it seems like this giant rock has quite a bit of history behind it, and I think that may be tied to the fact that both groups that have ever lived up there had names tying to outer space in some form or fashion. But before I dive in any further, if you wouldn't mind, please give me a thumbs up on the video to help out with the algorithm so that we can get this video out to as many One Piece fans as possible. Anyway, on to the theory.
Yeah.
While we haven't been given a ton of information about the origins of the Red Line yet in the story, the information that we do have seems to conflict just a little bit. Because on one hand, the Red Line seems like a natural structure because of the dialogue that we got with Marco when he was looking back to when Whitebeard said that Lunarians lived up there long before Merijois. And since the world government is 800 years old, that would mean that the Red Line has been there for at least 1,000 years, if not much longer. But it also seems unnatural because island whales like Laboon bang their head on it and get scars on their head like we've already seen a few times in the story. Just as if the Red Line isn't supposed to be there and it's in the way or something. So how can it seemingly be unnatural and natural at the very same time? This is a question that I've posed a few times on this channel, and while I've talked about why the government wanted it so bad and how we might even be able to destroy it in the future, this is where I'm finally going to explain the history behind this huge structure and what the ancient kingdom used it for before the world government took it over. So let's start with what I believe is one of the most valuable pieces of information about the Red Line, which is that it's made up of a chain of connected islands, all with different climates, which was told to us by Nami. Having different climates side by side like that is yet another seemingly unnatural phenomenon. And while I think Nami's probably talking about the entire Red Line, I think it's safe to say that she's at least talking about the part that's right next to them, which is coincidentally the part that's between Merijois and Fishman Island. And it's probably also the part of the Red Line that the other island whales bang their head on, since we found them right next to it when we entered the New World. And that is yet another indication that this thing is unnatural. That makes me think that even though there was a Red Line even before Merijois, the section it sits on top of right here is probably something that was added later on. Which does make a lot of sense, since this section does block off the sea between the Grand Line and the New World, which is a big advantage to the world government. And the fact that Lunarians have been hunted to near extinction while the government is still offering 100 million berry bounties for any information on them hints to me that they likely had something to do with that extinction. And since the Red Line is where both of these groups lived, it seems that it had to be really important to both of them. I mean, obviously the Lunarians lived there long ago, so it seems that maybe they just died out defending it from the world government. It kind of reminds me of when the Shandians had a massive battle protecting the Poneglyph long ago that Robin told us about, except maybe the Lunarians just lost. And since the Celestial Dragons live there now, maybe taking over the Red Line from the Lunarians, and potentially the entire ancient kingdom, was their entire goal. And maybe the reason why the government is offering 100 million berries for any information on living Lunarians isn't necessarily because of the physical threat that they impose, but because of the information that they might have. The reason that King seemed to know about Joy Boy, or at least he assumed that Kaido was him, may have been because of stories that were passed down, and that could include stories about why the Red Line was so valuable and why the Lunarians almost died out fighting for it. I mean, think about the first time that Kaido met King back in Punk Hazard during the flashback. He was a kid, but he was already asking Kaido about his ability to change the world, as if he already knows a lot of the messed up stuff that's happening, or at least that the world government needs to be taken down and something has to change. Maybe his parents, or just wherever he came from, told him about the distant past and what happened before they were wiped out. Or maybe King was just sent far into the future, much like Toki was. And another thing to think about is that if the Lunarians lived on the Red Line long before Merijois was there, and the ancient kingdom was around in that same time period, and they were as technologically advanced as Vegapunk has implied in the last few chapters, then there is virtually no way that these two civilizations weren't connected. And if the Lunarians didn't lose their homeland until the world government came along, then it would seem that that the Lunarians and the Ancient Kingdom lived in harmony, and may have even been deeply intertwined. I'm gonna throw a link down below to another video called The Green Line Theory from a good friend of mine named The Hidden Island, and I think it'll pair very well with this video, as does a lot of our content honestly, so definitely go check them out after this. But the key point that I want to make here is that the downfall of the Lunarians and the Ancient Kingdom also seem to be deeply intertwined, since they both coincide with the rise of the world government and the celestial dragons. As if the entire 100-year war that Shaka told us about in chapter 1066 was for control of the Red Line. With the power of the Red Line at their disposal, the government was able to enact a great cleansing and wipe the world of as much history as possible, like the history of what the Red Line was truly capable of. But going back to Nami's comment earlier about the Red Line being different islands chained together, what or who have we seen in the story of One Piece that could potentially bring different islands together in a straight line like that? Well, what about the continent puller himself, being Oars? I mean, the Red Line is probably the landmass most deserving of the title of continent that we have seen thus far in the story, because it is absolutely massive. And there is also an ice continent, which was mentioned in Don Chinjao's flashback, but I mean, just look at the size of the Red Line. I don't think any landmass in One Piece rivals this. And wouldn't that just be a crazy twist if Oars was the one who pulled some of the Red Line together? And while some of you may be saying that the Oars that we met in Thriller Bark was only around 500 years ago, that's true. However, Oars Jr. that we met in Marineford had Oars III on his flag. So therefore, it's very possible that the Oars that we met in Thriller Bark was maybe Oars II, and so there was an original Oars from before the Void Century. But maybe some of you are wondering why he would ever do that. I mean, if Oars Jr. is any indication, then Oars should just be a good person. And there are even a lot of strong theories on Oars being Joy Boy already, like this one from Preach that I'm going to link down below. So it at least initially seems kind of odd that Oars would want to block off the seas by pulling together the Red Line and hurt piracy as well as the peaceful whales, which all seems very antagonistic to the cause of the Ancient Kingdom, just as if Oars agreed to help out the world government by building the Red Line. But we also have to keep in mind that ancient giants apparently have been wiped out over the last however many hundred years, and while we don't know for certain, I think it stands to reason that that was probably because of the world government. And given what else I said about Oars Jr. being a good person, it just seems weird overall that Oars would want to help out the world government and hurt the Ancient Kingdom. So what if there was some ulterior motive to all of this? What if these islands that were pulled together to block the Red Line were meant to somehow help the Ancient Kingdom? As if blocking off this part of the sea was going to stop the world government from something dangerous, at least until Joy Boy had a chance to return in the future, which he said he would do on the Fishman Island poneglyph, which is directly underneath the part of the Red Line in question. So what could the Red Line have potentially been used for by the Ancient Kingdom that meant certain parts had to be blocked off to stop the world government? Well, I think before we can tackle that question, we need to consider what the Red Line used to look like. Because if we assume that the seas weren't totally blocked off so that ships and whales could still swim around freely, but there were also high points for the Lunarians to live on top of, just as Whitebeard mentioned, then it would probably have to look something like this. A line all the way around the world with several peaks that people can live on top of, and while I had it drawn this way for visualization purposes, you could imagine that these valleys could be beneath the ocean so that whales and ships could get across no problem. I mean, there would at least need to be gaps at each end of the Grand Line because of the whales that we've already met, and I imagine that there would also be some gaps in the other seas as well, just because it would be incredibly inconvenient just to only have two entrances. So I loosely would expect that there would have to be some other dips in the Red Line in other parts of the world, as I show right here. This shape would explain how there are peaks high up for God's land to exist, just like Whitebeard was telling us, but also how the seas weren't totally blocked off so that the island whales could navigate safely. And then eventually, when the world government showed up and tried taking it, maybe the Ancient Kingdom just plugged all the gaps so that the government couldn't use it for the same thing that they did. And what the Red Line was once used for is hinted right in the shape you're seeing right now, because that would basically just be a giant steering wheel that you would see on a typical ship. A steering wheel that could literally change the direction and spin of the Earth itself. And we should all know by now how important swirls are to the One Piece story because they're on all the devil fruits, including the Gomu Gomu no Mi. And they're on Sanji's eyebrows, which was actually brought up in an SBS, which is where Oda said that swirls are extremely important because every planet spins in circles. And if any of the planets stop spinning, then that could create crazy tidal waves, which would be very dangerous. And that Sanji's eyebrow contains that very same powerful energy. And I brought this up a lot in my Void Century video, but here I'm applying it in a much different way because basically what I'm saying is that the Ancient Kingdom did this to the Earth in a safe way so that they could guide the Earth through the universe as they pleased. By taking all of their people and resources with them, they could travel as far and as long as they wanted. It's like the Earth was a giant terraformed spaceship. And given that the Earth is our spaceship in real life basically, I can totally see Oda making some kind of joke like this that also just carries so much weight because of what it could mean for the universe and the One Piece world. And what's crazy is that we have already seen another island shape just like this, and that's Long Ring Longland. And if you've seen my Lafro Tale video, then you probably know where I'm going with this already. But I'm gonna recap a few things just for the sake of context. Like how everyone on Long Ring Longland is stretched out, and Tanjit told us that's because they all feel free, which allows them to stretch longer and taller than normal. And we should all know by now that that's exactly how Luffy's powers work in Gear 5th, which ties very closely into Joy Boy. And this island has 10 high points in a circle, which are all connected under the sea. This design right here is a perfect example of how the old Red Line could have been shaped so that there were Lunarians that lived on top, just like Tanjit's people, and also room for fish and boats to get through as they please, just like the low points that are submerged. And since this island makes everyone feel so free that they stretch out, then I think Joy Boy has some deep connection to this island. Like one idea that I posed before was that Joy Boy stretched this island into its current shape, and the people there still feel residual effects of that awakening. And I even proposed that Laugh Tale may be hidden underneath it and is only accessible during Agua Laguna when the tides are lower. So what if Joy Boy got the idea for Long Ring Longland because of the shape of the Red Line that he and the Ancient Kingdom were using to cruise through the universe? And that's why I like to call this whole theory the Long Ring Redland theory, because I think these two structures might just be connected. And take a look at many of the sun symbols that we've seen from various allied nations in the story, especially the Skypians, who literally have a steering wheel logo. The various points in a circle is most definitely a symbol for the sun, but it's also eerily close to that of Long Ring Longland, or just a steering wheel as well. The planet with a steering wheel shape wrapped around it, like I'm showing here, almost looks like a sun with sun rays shooting out of it, kind of like a soul rock from Pokemon or something. So they could easily be interchangeable on any of these logos to some degree, in my opinion. And thanks to some of the recent chapters in Egghead Island, we already know that the Ancient Kingdom was so advanced that it was like they were from 500 years in the future. So I don't think terraforming the planet into a spaceship is really as crazy as it sounds at first. We saw on the moon hieroglyphs in Anel's cover story that 3 sky races left the moon in pursuit of resources, so imagine if the Ancient Kingdom went one step further and found out how to take the resources with them wherever they went. And I think that's a very imaginative solution that's fitting of a kingdom that somebody like Joy Boy was a big part of. So what if the Ancient Kingdom just rode the planet around in space looking for new resources or making new friends? Basically, what if the entire planet was a group of space pirates? And then this led me to an interesting idea that maybe the Ancient Kingdom were space pirates and Emu was from a planet that they had ravaged. We have seen countless times in One Piece that pirates get a bad name even if they are good, so maybe Emu had a similar feeling about the Ancient Kingdom, except basically on a galactic scale. Maybe Emu had some pent-up resentment because of something that happened in the past on their home planet, and so they tried taking over the space-traveling planet themselves so that they couldn't travel around anymore and do whatever they were doing. And I'm not trying to imply that the Ancient Kingdom was actually bad per se, but it's just that groups always get framed unfairly in the One Piece world already, so maybe other planets viewing the Ancient Kingdom in that way makes sense. And if Emu or other people really were trying to take over the planet so that they could use the Red Line and cruise around the universe, then maybe the Ancient Kingdom filled in the gaps of the Red Line on purpose so that the steering wheel wouldn't move anymore. Like oars pulled them together as a last resort so that the steering wheel was stuck in in a certain position, one that would keep the planet rotating safely for at least 800 years or so. And maybe Joy Boy is required to return the red line to its rightful state, either via awakening or the ancient weapons or something. Basically, I think Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom may have filled in all the gaps around the red line so that the wheel couldn't spin and the Earth would just be stuck where it already was, so that they could buy themselves 800 years worth of time so that Emu doesn't take over the entire dang universe, at least until Joy Boy has a chance to return. And this idea of filling in the gaps is extra interesting because of Joy Boy's apology to Poseidon, which was left in Fishman Island, which, as I mentioned earlier, is coincidentally directly underneath Marijois and the portion of the red line that Nami seemed to be talking about, since she was right next to it when she made the comment about the connected islands. What if Joy Boy apologized because he was the one to fill in that part of the red line and banish the fishmen to the bottom of the sea for 800 years? Maybe that seems kind of crazy at first, but think about where it is, which is directly underneath Marijois. We just saw Emu vaporize Lelucia in a single blast, but Emu would have a really hard time doing that to Fishman Island if it also requires destroying Marijois and the red line that blocks the pirates from the New World. If Emu wanted to erase the Fishman and the Poseidon bloodline, he would also be erasing the red line that he fought so hard for. I mean, he could send some Marines down there, but that is a big challenge to get a bunch of Marines down to the bottom of the ocean where the Fishmen obviously have an advantage. Plus, Fishman Island is the only way that pirates have to get into the New World. So basically, Fishman Island may have been Joy Boy's biggest contingency plan, and his apology to Poseidon was all about how he basically forced them to stay down there for 800 years until he could return in the future and free them. Some situation like this would also make sense given what we learned about the giant robot in Egghead Island just a few chapters ago, because that robot attacked Marijois around the same time that the Fishmen joined the Reverie 200 years ago, and we know that that robot was built by the Ancient Kingdom. What if that was a failsafe to stop Poseidon from falling under the world government until it's time for Joy Boy to return? By wreaking havoc at Marijois around the same time that Fishmen joined the Reverie, people would probably just blame the newbies for the trouble, and then this could all mean that Joy Boy essentially manufactured the racism towards Fishmen on purpose so that they would stay under the sea where they needed to be so that they'd have a chance of defeating the world government in the future. If the Fishmen joined the rest of the world and had a seat at the Reverie, then Poseidon would fall under the world government and they wouldn't have a chance. And since Fishman Island is the only path into the New World, if they fell under the world government, they probably wouldn't let pirates through anymore. And if Luffy never got into the New World, he probably never awakens his fruit and becomes Joy Boy. And Odin even said that he wanted to open the borders because they need to welcome a certain someone in the future who is most likely Joy Boy. So obviously the Ancient Kingdom knew that there had to be a path into the New World at some point for the future Joy Boy to take. So under no circumstances could the Ancient Kingdom let Fishman Island fall under the world government. But now I think we need to talk about what this steering wheel could have meant for the rest of the moons orbiting the Earth. But before I do that, please make sure to drop a like because it really does make a massive difference. A difference almost as big as the red line itself. And using the red line to cruise through the universe may sound like the Ancient Kingdom was just having fun and maybe testing the limits on what they could do, but I think it was actually a lot more important to their survival than we think. Because water, light, and Verth are key elements to life in our world and even the One Piece world, so a planet with all of these resources in abundance would likely be considered a powerhouse in some way. I mean, we already saw 3 different races have to leave the moon in pursuit of resources that were on Earth. And think about how important Verth was in the Skypiea arc. There are already a lot of potential connections between this arc and the Void Century because of the fact that Enel called himself a god and he wanted to wipe out the island with a Rygo, much like how Emu did that to Lelucia. So perhaps the Verth in that arc was somewhat of a parallel for the Red Line or just the entire Earth itself, meaning it was just a smaller version of what Emu did, which was take all of the Verth, aka the entire planet Earth, and specifically the Red Line, potentially because it meant that he could then steer the planet into the true fairy Verth, aka the endless Verth, which is anywhere in the universe, much like how Enel wanted to go to the moon. This could be why Emu seems so unafraid to be as ruthless as possible when it comes to great cleansings and wiping people off the planet, because if these resources were to ever be lost or ruined, then the entire universe and a theoretical home planet for Emu may be at risk. I mean, we literally saw space pirates already with their own Jolly Roger in pressurized spacesuits. That alone should tell you that there's a lot more going on in space than we think in the One Piece world. And if there was already an ancient civilization on the moon, that should also hint to us that space travel is not a novel thing. I mean, the world nobles are called celestial dragons after all, and the Lunarians' name seems to tie them to the moon, which means that everyone who has lived on top of the Red Line has a name that ties to outer space. Plus, Whitebeard said that God's land used to be up there, and now the celestial dragons consider themselves to be gods. So it seems that anyone that has lived there has been considered a god in some sense. And during the reverie, Lucci told us that the celestial dragons are the gods who created this world. And perhaps he may not have been kidding. While the world was obviously around well before the current day celestial dragons, maybe all of these factors that I've talked about today just hint that the Lunarians, aka the gods of the past, were the ones who originally formed the Red Line and made it into the shape that it used to be, and maybe even terraformed the entire Earth to some degree. I mean, we already know that they can manifest fire and live in harsh conditions, so what if they found Earth a long time ago and molded it into the Red Line shape that I described earlier, so that they could then guide the entire planet to wherever they wanted, including whatever planet or galaxy that they originally came from. While their name does hint to the moon, I don't think it has to be the moon that we saw Enel on, because a moon can be any natural satellite that orbits Earth. And during the Ohara flashback, we actually saw a planetary model with a number of objects orbiting the Earth that could all be considered moons. And I'm going to cover that in great detail in just a minute. But first, the normal looking moon that we saw with Enel showed us that there are 3 sky races who lived on the moon a long time ago who all had white wings. That's another factor that makes me think that the black-winged Lunarians were probably from somewhere else. And from what we've seen, it doesn't look like Skypians, Birkins, or Shandorians can fly with their white wings. And while I'm not sure if we know that 100%, we've never seen them fly with those wings, and they almost lost their entire island in the Skypiea arc and none of them bothered flying away. So I feel pretty confident that the white wings mean that you can't fly on Earth. But King can, and King has a Pteranodon fruit, so some of you may be thinking that he flies because of that, but we saw him in base form many times flying throughout the raid, like earlier on when he was fighting Sanji, and even later on when he was fighting Zoro out of his Pteranodon form. So it seems like the black wings let you fly as opposed to the white wings of the Skypians, Birkins, and Shandians. So maybe the reason that they developed them while living on the moon was because there's less gravity there, so the wings help them maneuver in space. But all these factors make me think that the Lunarians had to come from a different moon or just a different planet altogether, despite their name initially leading many of us to think that it's the moon that we're already familiar with. So maybe what happened was that the Lunarians found the Earth thousands of years ago and molded it into the shape that would have let them use it as their own spaceship. Maybe the Ancient Kingdom and the Lunarians have been around since the Earth was formed because they terraformed it all to be their very own spaceship, a ship that naturally gives them a virtual endless supply of resources that they're able to take with them anywhere. This could very well mean that Nika or Joy Boy themselves were Lunarian, which wouldn't shock me at all since the government wanted to eliminate them so badly, just like they had been pursuing the Gum Gum fruit for so long. And since King seems to know a lot about Joy Boy based on all of his discussions with Kaido. And all of this talk about terraforming the Earth into a spaceship helps make a lot of sense out of the geocentric model that we saw in Ohara. Usually a model like this will be used to represent the entire solar system, because the sun is 109 times bigger than our planet, so everything in our solar system orbits around that. That's why it's called the solar system. But in this model, the Earth is the center, making it a geocentric model. But there's also not a sun anywhere to be seen, at least not obviously. And since One Piece has a very similar day-night structure as our world, there's likely a giant sun in their universe too. And we have to keep in mind that Clover probably got all this information from what he found out about the Ancient Kingdom. And with the Ancient Kingdom being as advanced as we now know it is thanks to Vegapunk, I highly doubt that that information would be inaccurate. And with all of the Clover hype the last few chapters, I really doubt that he would go through the trouble of building a giant model like this in the middle of the Ohara library unless he knew it was accurate and probably important in some way. Like that this model isn't just to show the entire solar system for education purposes, but rather it's the geocentric model of all the moons that will orbit the Earth regardless of where the Earth goes. Like if they were to knock the Earth off off course in some way using a steering wheel, what planets would follow them? So what if the ancient kingdom wasn't just a bunch of allied nations, but it was a bunch of allied planets? All of these spheres circling the Earth could be considered moons, so the Lunarians could have come from any of these planets rotating the Earth. And since Earth was the center of this system, it would make sense that they focused on terraforming that planet, since it would naturally bring the rest of the planets with them via gravity, as opposed to making all of those moons rotate and direct their own path. Perhaps the story that Enel found on the moon regarding the sky races who went to the Earth was just a microcosm of the story of Lunarians. They too may have left their moon and descended to Earth in search of resources. Perhaps part of the reason they terraformed it was to move closer or further from the sun, and that may be what gave Nika the title of Sun God originally. The Earth may have just been a huge landmass but was too close to the sun for most people to live on or something, except the Lunarians. And eventually Nika was able to become a giant and steer the planet away so that other races could now enjoy the resources that the Earth had to offer. This is what may have given them the title of Sun God. And this made me think that maybe the reason devil fruits ever came into existence in the first place was because they needed to make somebody a giant to steer this ship. But I'm going to talk about that a lot more in a future video on all about how devil fruits came into existence, so make sure you go subscribe because that video will be out sometime soon. But this geocentric system in Ohara may have just been the ancient kingdom's alliance, if you will. All of those planets probably had a vested interest in the resources of the Earth and where it was situated in the universe. So the ancient kingdom may have been an alliance of every race in the truest sense of the word. Like Big Mom has the goal of building a nation with every race in it, but maybe the ancient kingdom did the very same thing, except even with life on other planets. And by allying with every race, they were capable of the insane things that we've seen on Egghead Island. And as I mentioned earlier, the Lunarians and the ancient kingdom almost had to be on good terms since they seemed to coexist for a very long time before the world government came along. What if that's because the Lunarians were key to the creation of this ancient kingdom? Like I said, Lucci told us that the celestial dragons are the gods who created this world. What if the celestial dragons of today spout that nonsense because they took over the red line from the real gods who actually created this world? The Lunarians' name may hint that they're from another planet, but wouldn't it be ironic if they're actually the ones who found Earth and made it livable in the first place? This would help really explain why the world government wants them all eliminated so badly, and why they're even willing to get rid of the warlords in Vegapunk now that they have control of the Seraphim, which are basically just Lunarian clones of the warlords. Now that they have access to the power of the Lunarians, they probably feel like literally nobody can stop them since they know that Lunarians were literally strong enough to create the Earth that we know today. And they led the Earth for likely thousands of years as gods. I mean, we already know that Lunarians can control fire and fly, so if they could also traverse through space on their own terraformed spaceship, that would almost make them like celestial dragons in a way. Not the world noble kind, but literally celestial dragons, like space traveling beings that can fly and can control fire. And perhaps that is exactly why those that took over the government chose that name, because they took over the position from the true celestial dragons. And if Luffy were to find the One Piece, which I talked all about in my Lafro Tale video, then destroying various parts of the Red Line would enable the use of the steering wheel once again. If he destroys the gaps in it around the world, then he may free up the seas enough for Laboon and the island whales, but he would also enable the world government to yet again use the Red Line for their own purposes and travel the universe, perhaps to conquer other planets as they want, which was exactly what Joy Boy was probably avoiding. Joy Boy may have just left this decision up to the next person to take his will because he was unable to defeat the government for whatever reason, but with Luffy being who he is, I fully expect him to decide to destroy the Red Line and leave it all up to a big clash with the world government for the right to the Earth spaceship. And I'd like to end the video with a quick shout out to some of my newest members of the channel, being Mr. Bushido, Reese Lucas, 2Bunky, and Gintone. Some of these people have great One Piece ideas of their own, so I'm going to make sure to put some of their links of their content down below. And I also want to give a special thanks to a longtime follower of the channel named Michael Evans, who actually helped me conjure up this idea on Discord. So if you'd like to connect with me on Discord and maybe get your own idea shouted out in a video, make sure to join the Discord using the link down below. And if you want to see what the government did during the Void Century, or or even what the One Piece actually is, make sure to go check out some of my other content like the videos that you should probably already see on the screen. Later.